And here's the chilling part. Backhand index pointing right call to action, immediately after hook. It was this machine, this little forgotten device with its blinking light, that would years later blow this case wide open. Because when that message was finally played, the voice on it would not only identify the killer but reveal a chilling, deliberate trap that had been hiding in plain sight. This is the story of how a forgotten answering machine solved a murder that otherwise might never have been solved. Stay with me. The weight of grief. Detectives moved methodically, documenting every inch of the scene. But nothing was straightforward. Linda's front door showed no signs of damage. The windows were locked from the inside. A stranger forcing their way in seemed unlikely. Was this someone Linda knew? Her children clung to an officer's coat as paramedics gently carried their mother's body away. Outside, in the snow, neighbors gathered with wide, fearful eyes. For them, Linda wasn't just another statistic. She was the single mother who offered free babysitting. The neighbor who dropped off casseroles when someone was sick. The friend who always sent cards on birthdays. Now she was gone, brutally taken in her own home. Detectives worked the case hard that first week. Every ex-boyfriend, every colleague, every friend was questioned. But the leads went nowhere. Some neighbors claimed they'd seen a dark sedan idling near Linda's house late that night, its headlights off. But in a city the size of Dayton, dark sedans were everywhere. Weeks turned into months. The answering machine, bagged as evidence, was stored in a box along with other household electronics. Police assumed whatever message was left there would be something mundane: telemarketers, co-workers, maybe a relative calling late. It didn't feel urgent compared to the bloody crime scene. And as the investigation dragged on, the case began to cool. But for Linda's family, life froze in that winter of 1998. Her sister, Karen, took in the children. Every night, the kids asked the same heartbreaking question: when is Mom coming back? And every night, Karen had to fight back tears as she explained that their mother was never coming home. The case that went cold. By the year 2000, Linda Harper's murder was officially labeled a cold case. Files sat stacked in dusty cabinets. Detectives retired or moved on. The city's attention shifted to other crimes, fresher tragedies. But in the Harper household, the wound never healed. Linda's children grew up carrying the shadow of that night with them. They avoided talking about it in public, but privately, they replayed every memory of their mother, her laugh in the kitchen, her tired smile after night shifts, the way she tucked them in with an extra blanket when the cold seeped through the old house's drafty windows. And still, the question remained: who killed her? That unanswered question would linger for nearly a decade. Until one day, buried in an evidence room, someone stumbled across a sealed box labeled Harper case. Inside was that answering machine, its tiny cassette tape still intact. Why the machine was forgotten. To understand how something so crucial could be overlooked, you have to remember the technology of the time. In 1998, digital voicemail wasn't common. People relied on clunky answering machines with miniature tapes that could record 15, maybe 30 minutes of audio. After a loved one was killed, police usually gathered the machine as part of the evidence sweep. But if the blinking light didn't seem connected to the crime, it wasn't always reviewed immediately. In Linda's case, it simply fell through the cracks. But now, years later, a technician threading through old evidence happened to test it. When he pressed play, the static-filled hiss of a decades-old tape came alive. And then, a voice. A man's voice. Threatening. Sinister. Almost mocking. The message had been left just hours before Linda was killed. And as investigators leaned in to listen, they realized this wasn't some prank call or random message. It was a recording of the killer himself. That discovery would reawaken a case many believed was buried forever. The voice on the tape would send shockwaves through the community, reopen wounds, and finally lead investigators down the twisting path toward justice. But how could a single message, forgotten for years, solve a murder so brutal and baffling? That's where the story truly begins. The forgotten voice. For nearly a decade, Linda Harper's case sat in silence. Dayton police had filed it away in the cold case archives, where it lived alongside hundreds of unsolved crimes, each file a reminder of justice delayed, sometimes justice denied. Detectives who had once sworn they'd find Linda's killer moved on, retired, or simply accepted the heartbreaking reality: there wasn't enough evidence to move forward. Her children, now teenagers, carried that silence with them. They avoided questions at school, brushed off well-meaning condolences, and tried to blend into the background. But behind closed doors, they were still haunted by the sounds they'd heard that night: the sudden thud, the muffled argument, their mother's scream cut short. Life had moved on for everyone else. But not for them. The rediscovery. In 2007, nearly 10 years after Linda's death, the Dayton Police Department began a project to digitize old evidence. Boxes were pulled from dusty shelves, cataloged, and checked for anything that might be re-examined with modern tools. That's when a young technician named Eric Lawson opened the box labeled Harper Case. Inside were standard items: photographs, autopsy reports, fingerprints too smudged to be useful. But buried beneath it all was the beige plastic answering machine. It looked almost comical, outdated, heavy, a relic of a pre-digital world. Its power cord was neatly coiled, its buttons worn from years of use. Eric almost set it aside, but then he noticed the little cassette tape still locked inside. Curiosity got the better of him. Eric threaded the tape into a player. A burst of static filled the room. Then came silence. And then, a voice. The voice on the tape. At first, it was hard to make out. The tape hissed, warbling with age. But slowly, words emerged. "Linda, you think you can hide from me?" The voice was deep, male, tinged with mocking amusement. Then came a harsh laugh, low and chilling. "You're going to pay for this. Tonight." A click. Silence. Eric froze. He rewound the tape. Played it again. The message was barely 15 seconds long, but it felt like a punch to the chest. This wasn't a wrong number. This wasn't a prank. This was a direct threat to Linda Harper, left just hours before she was killed. When Eric brought the tape to his supervisor, seasoned detectives who had worked cold cases for years gathered around. Some were stunned into silence. Others cursed under their breath. They all knew what this meant: Linda's murder had just been dragged out of the cold files and back into the spotlight. The investigation reopens. The tape was sent to the FBI for voice analysis. At the same time, detectives began combing through Linda's past again, piecing together the final months of her life. Who would have wanted her dead? They uncovered a detail that had been overlooked in 1998. Linda had recently ended a relationship with a man named David Kramer, a warehouse supervisor she'd met through friends. Neighbors remembered him as intense, jealous, and often hovering around Linda's house uninvited. He'd been questioned after her death, but with no physical evidence tying him to the scene, he'd been cleared. Now, with this tape, he was suddenly back in the spotlight. Detectives tracked down David. By then, he was living 2 towns over, remarried, working nights at a logistics company. When asked about Linda, his answers were rehearsed, almost mechanical. He claimed they had drifted apart, that he hadn't seen her in weeks before she died. But when detectives played the tape for him, his face drained of color. The forensic breakthrough. The FBI's analysis was damning. The voice on the tape had unique markers: cadence, inflection, the way certain consonants were pronounced. While it wasn't a perfect match, it was consistent with David Kramer. But there was more. On the original answering machine tape, beneath the threatening message, technicians found faint background noise. Using advanced audio enhancement, they identified a detail that made the hairs on every detective's neck stand on end. A clock chime. A very specific chime, from a grandfather clock that had once stood in Linda's living room. The killer hadn't just called Linda. He had called from inside her house. The horror of betrayal. That realization sent shockwaves through the team. This wasn't a drive-by threat. This wasn't a stalker lurking outside. This was someone Linda had trusted enough to let inside her home. Her children's memories suddenly made sense. The muffled male voice. Their mother's desperate cry. The struggle. David had been in her house that night. He had left the message as a twisted form of psychological torture, calling Linda from her own phone, leaving a warning he knew she might not hear until it was too late. And then, just hours later, he made good on his threat. The emotional weight. When detectives brought this information to Linda's sister, Karen, she broke down. For years, she had suspected David. She remembered the way he looked at Linda, the controlling way he spoke to her, the way Linda confided that she was afraid of him after they broke up. But with no proof, Karen had buried those suspicions. Now the proof was undeniable. Linda's children, now nearly adults, listened to the tape in a private meeting with detectives. The sound of that voice, the mocking cruelty of it, shattered them. One of them walked out of the room in tears. The other sat silently, fists clenched, eyes red. It wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about reclaiming their mother's story from silence. Setting the stage. With this new evidence, police prepared to arrest David Kramer. But there was still one major problem. The tape, while damning, wasn't absolute proof. Defense attorneys could argue it was inconclusive, distorted, or circumstantial. Detectives needed something more. Something physical. And as they dug deeper, they uncovered a second piece of evidence, one that had been hiding in plain sight for years. A forgotten box of Linda's belongings, stored in the evidence locker, contained a crumpled note. Scrawled in hurried, angry handwriting were the words, "You'll regret this." And the handwriting matched David Kramer's. The hook forward. The discovery of the answering machine tape had cracked the case wide open. But proving David's guilt in court would require building an ironclad chain of evidence. Over the next several months, detectives would unearth a shocking pattern of abuse, intimidation, and escalating violence, evidence that painted a chilling picture of obsession and control. And when David Kramer finally went to trial, it wouldn't just be Linda Harper's murder under scrutiny. It would be a portrait of how a forgotten machine, a blinking red light, and a voice frozen in time could speak louder than silence. The past that wouldn't stay buried. Imagine carrying around a memory so heavy that it shapes the way you see the world. For Linda Harper's children, that memory was the sound of their mother's scream in the middle of the night, followed by silence. For almost 10 years, that silence was all they had, no justice, no closure. But then came the tape. That voice. Those chilling words. "You're going to pay for this. Tonight." That single sentence, trapped on a forgotten answering machine, ripped open every wound and forced the case back into the light. And it wasn't just the children's lives that were about to change. When investigators pulled on that thread, the voice, the handwriting, the evidence buried in plain sight, they uncovered a story darker and more twisted than anyone imagined. This isn't just about a murder. This is about obsession, control, and the way evil sometimes hides in everyday life. Stay with me. The reopened case. Detectives knew they had something powerful, but fragile. A distorted tape and a scrawled note weren't enough on their own. If they were going to bring David Kramer to justice, they needed to build an ironclad case that could stand up in court. They started by retracing every step of Linda's final months. Old friends and co-workers were interviewed again. Neighbors who had tried to forget were asked to remember. What they found was a pattern, a chilling one. Linda had complained about David's jealousy. How he'd drive by her house late at night. How he'd show up uninvited at her work. She'd even confided to a nurse friend that she feared he'd do something crazy if she didn't cut off contact completely. That fear suddenly had a voice on tape to back it up. The children's memory. Detectives brought in Linda's children, now older teens, to re-examine what they remembered from that night. One of them recalled something strange, the sound of the phone ringing downstairs just before the argument began. At the time, as children, they hadn't thought much of it. But now, paired with the answering machine tape, the timeline clicked into place. The call wasn't random. It was staged. David had deliberately left the message first, taunting Linda, then confronted her in person hours later. That detail was devastating. Not only did it tie David more directly to the crime, it painted a picture of cruelty, how he wanted Linda to know terror before the end. The clock. Then came the forensic bombshell. Audio experts enhanced the background noise on the tape. Beneath the static, they heard the faint ticking and chiming of a grandfather clock. It was unique, melodic, slightly off-key due to age. Linda had owned such a clock. This meant the call hadn't been placed from outside. It was made from inside her house. That detail shifted the case from speculation to horror. David hadn't just been lurking in the shadows. He had been inside, violating the safety of her home, using her own phone to leave a message meant to torment her. It was sadistic. Personal. The handwriting. Investigators then re-examined the angry note found in Linda's belongings. "You'll regret this." Handwriting experts compared it to samples taken from David's job applications, signed checks, and letters. The loops, the pressure, the jagged slant, it all pointed to him. The note, paired with the message, painted a picture of obsession spiraling into violence. Building the net. The more detectives dug, the more the noose tightened. Coworkers recalled seeing David parked outside Linda's hospital late at night, staring at the entrance. Neighbors remembered arguments, Linda shouting "Leave me alone" on more than one occasion. And then came the discovery that made prosecutors sit up straighter. In 1997, just a year before Linda's death, David had been questioned in connection with another domestic dispute, an ex-girlfriend who claimed he threatened her with eerily similar words, "You'll pay for this tonight." She hadn't pressed charges. But the echo was undeniable. The family's resolve. When detectives shared all of this with Linda's family, the reaction was a storm of emotions. Her sister Karen felt vindicated, her instincts about David had been right all along. But that validation came with pain. For Linda's children, it was worse. They weren't just reliving their mother's murder. They were realizing the killer had been a man they once saw sitting at their kitchen table. Laughing. Smiling. Pretending to be part of their lives. It was betrayal in its purest form. The arrest. Armed with the answering machine tape, the note, witness testimony, and David's history of threats, police finally moved in. On a cold January morning in 2008, nearly 10 years after Linda's murder, David Kramer was arrested outside his workplace. Colleagues watched in shock as he was handcuffed, shoved into a cruiser, and driven away. Inside the interrogation room, detectives slid the tape recorder across the table. When they pressed play, David's eyes darted, his lips trembled. He tried to deny it, but the weight of the evidence pressed down. Still, he never confessed. The trial. At trial, prosecutors leaned heavily on the answering machine tape. They played it for the jury, filling the courtroom with that deep, mocking voice. Gasps echoed. Some jurors visibly shivered. Linda's children sat in the front row, gripping each other's hands. For them, it was unbearable, yet necessary. The defense argued the tape was inconclusive, distorted, not enough to convict. But prosecutors countered with the clock chime, the handwriting, the pattern of threats. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a horrifying picture. David wasn't just a suspect. He was the killer. Emotional closing. When the jury finally delivered its verdict, guilty of murder, Linda's family wept openly. It had taken a decade, but justice had arrived. And in an almost poetic twist, it was Linda herself, her foresight in buying that answering machine, her instinct to record every call, that had given her the final word. Her killer could try to silence her. But the machine remembered. And in the end, that forgotten device spoke louder than his denials ever could. Forward hook. But here's the haunting part. David's conviction brought closure to one family, but also unearthed new questions. Because buried in his past were more women, more threats, more moments where violence almost erupted. Had Linda been his only victim? Or was her answering machine the only one that had ever caught him in the act? That's where the story widens, and darkens. patterns in the shadows. The courtroom erupted with emotion the day David Kramer was found guilty. For Linda Harper's family, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had finally been served, but the hole Linda left behind could never be filled. Her children clutched framed photos of their mother, tears running freely as they whispered, "We did it, Mom. We did it." But as the community began to breathe again, investigators faced a disturbing realization: David's conviction might not be the end of the story. Because when detectives dug into David Kramer's past, what they found suggested Linda Harper's murder wasn't an isolated act of rage. It was part of a much darker pattern, a pattern that hinted he may have stalked, threatened, and possibly harmed other women long before that winter night in 1998. Stay with me. The first echo. It started with a file from 1997, a year before Linda's death. A woman named Melissa Grant had reported David for harassment. They had dated briefly, but when Melissa ended things, David grew obsessive. He left notes on her car, called her house at all hours. One night, she found him waiting in the shadows of her driveway. In her statement to police, Melissa described the final straw, a phone call in which David told her, "You'll regret this tonight." Those words were almost identical to the message left on Linda's answering machine. Melissa had been terrified, but ultimately, she decided not to press charges. She thought walking away would end it. And eventually, David did leave her alone. But hearing about Linda's case years later, Melissa admitted something chilling. "I always wondered if he'd go after someone else." The college girlfriend. Then came another discovery. In 1993, while attending a community college in Indiana, David had dated a woman named Rachel Morris. Friends remembered him as controlling even then, calling her in public, getting angry when she so much as spoke to other men. Rachel's roommate recalled an incident where David showed up unannounced, banging on their dorm door late at night. When Rachel refused to let him in, he shouted through the door, "If you don't open this, you'll regret it." Rachel eventually broke off the relationship. Within months, she transferred to another school. No crime was reported, but the pattern was undeniable. The threats, the obsession, the rage when rejected, it had been there all along. The silence of the victims. As investigators pieced these stories together, a heartbreaking theme emerged. None of these women had pressed charges. None of them had felt like they had enough evidence. Many feared retaliation if they spoke out. And so David Kramer slipped through the cracks, over and over again. Linda Harper had not been his first victim of control. She was simply the one whose death left behind evidence that couldn't be ignored. The voice on tape. What haunted detectives most was the voice on Linda's answering machine. The mocking tone. The deliberate phrasing. The way David wanted Linda to know what was coming. It was a voice that had been heard before, by Melissa, by Rachel, by who knows how many others, but never recorded. That 15-second message became more than just evidence. It became a symbol of every ignored warning, every dismissed report, every woman who had been silenced by fear. The psychological profile. To understand David's behavior, prosecutors consulted forensic psychologists. What they painted was chilling. Obsessive attachment. David formed unhealthy bonds, seeing women not as partners but as possessions. Fear of abandonment. Rejection triggered rage, transforming him from clingy to dangerous. Pattern of escalation. Each relationship showed a steady climb from jealousy to threats to violence. Need for control. The phone calls, the notes, the surveillance. It wasn't just anger. It was about power. And Linda's case was the culmination. When she finally cut ties completely, David crossed the final line. The forgotten answering machine. It's worth pausing here. Because the truth is, if Linda's answering machine hadn't been bagged, if that technician hadn't pressed play almost a decade later, David might have remained free. The tape was more than evidence. It was Linda's final defense, speaking from beyond the grave. Without it, David would have been just another person of interest, a name whispered but never proven. The forgotten answering machine became the one thing he couldn't control. The community's reaction. News of David's conviction and the revelations about his past sent shockwaves through Dayton. Women who had dated him came forward, some admitting they'd always felt uneasy, others confessing to receiving threatening calls they had never reported. It was as though the tape had given them permission to finally speak. And while none of those incidents rose to the level of Linda's case, they built a portrait of a predator who had operated in the shadows for years. The children's resolve. For Linda's children, learning about David's history was both devastating and clarifying. It proved their mother hadn't been targeted randomly. She hadn't asked for it, as some cruel rumors suggested. She had been hunted, systematically, by a man who had a long history of making women fear him. In interviews years later, one of the children would say, "That tape, it wasn't just Mom's voice being answered. It was every woman he ever scared. It proved we weren't crazy. It proved he was the monster." The lingering mystery. But even as David sat behind bars, one question remained. Had Linda been his only murder victim? Detectives scoured unsolved cases in the region from the late 90s. A few bore eerie similarities: single women living alone, mysterious phone calls reported before they disappeared, cases that never reached closure. None could be definitively tied to David. But the suspicion lingered. Some investigators still believe Linda Harper's answering machine didn't just solve one case. It may have prevented others. By catching David when it did, the tape may have saved lives. Hook forward. And here's the part that stings. Even after the trial, even after David was sentenced to life in prison, the Harper family couldn't escape one cruel reality: justice had taken 10 years. 10 years of birthdays missed. 10 years of holidays spent in silence. 10 years where the killer lived free. Which raises the haunting question: how many other families are out there, waiting, hoping, praying, for some overlooked detail, a blinking light, a forgotten tape, to finally break the silence? The weight of justice. When the gavel struck wood, the courtroom seemed to exhale. David Kramer had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, at least on paper, had been delivered. But justice, Linda Harper's children would soon learn, doesn't erase pain. It doesn't rewind time. It doesn't bring back birthdays, bedtime stories, or the sound of a mother's laughter echoing through the house. Because while the city of Dayton celebrated a victory, Linda's family discovered that justice is not an ending, it's the beginning of another kind of fight. A fight to live with the memories, the trauma, and the endless echo of a 15-second message that had changed everything. Stay with me, because the aftermath of this case is as haunting as the crime itself. The first night without fear. For the first time in over a decade, Linda's children slept through the night without waking in terror. They knew the man who had taken their mother's life was never coming back. Her son, Daniel, then a teenager, whispered to reporters, "I don't have to look over my shoulder anymore." But even as the fear faded, another feeling grew stronger: anger. Anger at the system that had failed to protect their mom. Anger at how long it had taken. Anger that it took a forgotten answering machine to do what witnesses, reports, and warnings never could. The stain on a childhood. Daniel and his sister, Emily, spent their entire childhood carrying the weight of Linda's absence. School events were the hardest. On Mother's Day, when other kids made cards in class, they made nothing. At recitals, there was always an empty chair in the front row. At graduations, when names were called, they looked for her face in the crowd and never found it. Years later, Emily admitted, "Every time someone said justice was served, I wanted to scream. Because justice would have been having my mom there." The community's reckoning. Dayton had been shaken to its core by Linda's murder. But when the truth about David Kramer's long history came out, how many women he had stalked, how many warnings were ignored, the shock turned into outrage. Community groups formed. Candlelight vigils became protests. Women who had once stayed silent began speaking out. One survivor held a sign that read, "We don't need another Linda." The case became a rallying point, not just about Linda, but about every woman who had been dismissed, minimized, or left unprotected. The answering machine on display. perhaps the most surreal moment came when the prosecutor's office donated Linda's answering machine to a traveling exhibit on forensic history. Behind glass, under soft museum lighting, sat the beige plastic machine, its red light permanently frozen in playback mode. Visitors stood in silence as the exhibit explained how a 15-second tape had solved what once seemed unsolvable. Some people cried. Others walked away shaken. Because there was something profoundly unsettling about seeing such an ordinary object displayed like a relic of horror. The tape that wouldn't die. For Linda's family, the answering machine was both salvation and curse. It had given them justice. But it also became a ghost. The tape was played in court over and over, and each time, Linda's children heard the voice of the man who destroyed their world. "You'll regret this. Tonight." Emily once said in an interview, "That voice will never leave me. I still hear it sometimes at night. I hear it in my dreams." The irony was painful. The very evidence that freed them from fear kept haunting them. The killer's silence. From his prison cell, David Kramer refused to speak. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the terror he had caused. Reporters wrote to him. Documentarians requested interviews. Victims demanded answers. He never responded. The man whose voice had once controlled and terrified women across decades now gave nothing. His silence became its own form of cruelty. The lasting mystery. Even after the trial, detectives quietly kept working. Because Linda's murder had always felt bigger. There were other unsolved cases in the Midwest during the 1990s, women who vanished, women found dead under strange circumstances. No evidence tied David directly. But the patterns, the whispers, the timeline, they lined up too neatly to ignore. One retired detective put it bluntly. Linda's answering machine solved her case. But I don't think she was his only victim. The children grown. By the early 2010s, Daniel and Emily were adults, trying to build lives that weren't defined by tragedy. Daniel joined the Navy. Emily studied social work, determined to help children who had lost parents. In every interview, they spoke not of hatred for David, but of love for Linda. She was more than how she died, Daniel said. She was how she lived. She saved lives as a nurse. She loved us fiercely. That's what I hold on to. But the truth is, Linda's case is rare. Most families never get a breakthrough. Most forgotten tapes are never found, never played, never turned into justice. Which raises a haunting question: how many answers are still sitting in evidence rooms, hidden in boxes, gathering dust, waiting to speak? The ghosts of the tape. The conviction of David Kramer should have been the end. It should have been the final page in a story drenched with grief. But for detectives, survivors, and Linda Harper's family, it felt more like a pause. Because while one murder was solved, the echoes of that forgotten answering machine seemed to stretch far beyond Linda's home in Dayton. And here's the chilling truth: the tape that solved Linda's case may also point to other victims, women whose stories were never finished, whose families never heard a verdict, and whose killers may still be unknown. Stay with me, because what comes next suggests Linda's murder was not an isolated act, but part of a much darker pattern. The case that wouldn't rest. Not long after David's sentencing, cold case detectives across Ohio began comparing notes. Why? Because the voice on Linda's tape, the cold, deliberate "you'll regret this tonight," wasn't just terrifying. It was familiar. Several officers swore they had heard something like it before, in other investigations. One pointed to the 1996 disappearance of Karen Reynolds, a 28-year-old teacher who had filed multiple reports about a man harassing her by phone. She vanished without a trace. Her case went cold. Another recalled Sharon Willis, found strangled in 1994 in Indiana. Friends had told police she received late-night calls from a man she once dated. The reports piled up. Different towns. Different years. Different women. And in each one, a recurring detail: the voice on the phone. The forgotten calls. Technology in the 1990s didn't leave the kind of digital trails we rely on today. Caller ID was new. Most phone companies didn't keep records long. But families remembered. Women remembered. One woman, who asked not to be named, came forward after David's trial. She had lived just 2 streets over from Linda in the late 1990s. She said she once answered her phone late at night to hear a man whisper, "You'll regret this." She never reported it. She thought it was a prank. But after hearing the tape in the news, she realized it was the exact same voice. The shadow victims. Investigators began quietly cross-referencing David's movements. He had lived in Indiana during college. He moved to Ohio in the mid-1990s. He traveled for work, often to small towns. And in every place he lived, unsolved cases of missing or murdered women dotted the map. Nothing definitive tied him to them. But the pattern was unsettling. It left detectives with a gnawing question. Had Linda's answering machine only solved one murder, or had it accidentally exposed a serial predator whose true body count would never be known? The family's dilemma. For Linda's children, these whispers cut deep. Part of them wanted closure, wanted to believe their mother had been David's only victim, that her death wasn't part of something larger and more horrifying. But another part of them felt compelled to know the truth. Emily, by then in her 20s, put it simply. If there are other families out there, they deserve what we got. They deserve answers. The killer's silence. And yet, David Kramer remained silent. In prison, he never spoke of Linda. Never admitted guilt. Never hinted at other crimes. When pressed by psychologists, he would simply smile and say, "I don't remember." That refusal to speak became its own torment. Because silence can be as cruel as confession. A legacy of fear. Even years later, women in Dayton admitted they still checked their locks twice at night. Some bought new phones, terrified by the thought of a voice slipping through the line in the dark. Linda's answering machine had done more than capture a threat, it had captured the essence of fear. Because the most chilling thing wasn't the murder itself. It was knowing the killer could reach into your home, into your most private spaces, with nothing more than a whisper on tape. The museum visit. One of the most haunting moments came when Linda's grown children visited the forensic history exhibit where her answering machine was displayed. They stood in front of the glass case, staring at the object that had both saved and scarred them. Daniel whispered, almost to himself. That machine caught him. But how many more voices like his are still out there? Emily squeezed his hand. Neither had an answer. Because here's the thing, Linda's story ends in a courtroom. But the story of the forgotten tape? That story doesn't end. It lingers, in every cold case file, in every family still waiting, in every unanswered call that may have been more than a prank. And that brings us to the final chapter, where Linda's case becomes more than a solved murder. It becomes a warning. The last message. The courtroom was long empty. The reporters had gone home. David Kramer sat in a prison cell, his silence as heavy as ever. But Linda Harper's story didn't end with a verdict. It lived on in her children's lives. It lived on in the community of Dayton. And most of all, it lived on in that one ordinary object, a beige answering machine, its tiny cassette tape holding the voice that solved the murder. Because what makes Linda's story unforgettable isn't just the crime. It's the reminder that sometimes, the smallest details, the things we overlook, the things we throw in a box, can become the key to justice. And that means, right now, somewhere out there, another forgotten clue could be waiting to speak. Stay with me, because this ending isn't about closure, it's about what lingers. A family's survival. Daniel and Emily Harper grew up with a wound no sentence could heal. But they also grew up with strength forged in tragedy. They carried their mother's memory into every milestone. Daniel in his Navy uniform, Emily with her degree in social work. And when people asked how they kept going, Emily said, "Because my mom didn't get the chance to. We live for her." The town that changed. Dayton would never forget Linda's case. It forced the community to face the failures of the system, the ignored reports, the missed warnings, the women who weren't protected. But it also ignited something. Awareness. Neighborhood watches expanded. Laws were challenged. Shelters gained funding. Linda's story became a cautionary tale, yes, but also a rallying cry. The tape that still plays. The answering machine still exists, sealed in evidence archives now, its tape preserved. Detectives sometimes play it for training. Young officers sit in silence as the grainy voice hisses. "You'll regret this. Tonight." It lasts 15 seconds. But in those 15 seconds is a decade of pain, a decade of waiting, a decade of lives changed forever. The silence that haunts. David never admitted to Linda's murder, never confessed to stalking the other women, never revealed whether more victims existed. His silence was absolute. But in a way, it didn't matter. Because Linda's answering machine had already spoken for him. It had caught his voice. It had exposed his threat. It had convicted him. And for Linda's family, that was enough. The final lesson. Linda Harper's story is not just about tragedy. It's about how justice can sometimes hide in the most ordinary places. A box in a police station. A tape no one thought to play. It's about how even the smallest forgotten details can carry a voice that refuses to be silenced. And it's about how that voice, Linda's voice, through the machine that caught her killer, still echoes today. So here's the takeaway. If this story gripped you, if it made you stop and think about how fragile justice can be, then do one thing, share it. Because Linda's case was solved by a forgotten clue, but there are countless families still waiting, countless tapes, photos, and files gathering dust. And maybe, just maybe, someone hearing this will be the one to recognize a detail, to connect it, to finally bring answers to another family. Because sometimes, the scariest part of a story isn't what we know. It's what we've forgotten.